Good morning and good yontif. Happy Chayel. Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're on page 1468. Okay. So yesterday I gave a broader and general overview of this last section of Ayin Beis, contextualizing it to what we've been learning till now, and especially looking into the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe, the Chanukah Maimorim, Mi Kashem Elokeinu HaMagbiya L'Sheves, that helps us understand many of the ideas that are being developed here, and will also help us understand what the end of the story is, even though the Rebbe Rashab never ended up finishing the Hemshech. But from those Maimorim, we will be able to derive what the general plot, at least, is. So what we're middle of discussing is the appreciating what Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad and Baruch Shem teaches us. What is the contemplation when we say those prayers every day, which lead to V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha, to loving God? So the way to come to love God in a world where the animal soul loves this physical world, loves materialism. So it's not a small feat. How do you transform that? How do you change the natural inclination that a human being has to this material world and bring out a love to godliness? So he says, by contemplating on Hashem Echad, and specifically Yichud Elah and Yichud Tata, the utter unity of the divine with existence. And to understand that, on the bottom of page 1466, and the top of 1467, he began to explain what this Yichud is by understanding and contrasting the very creation of the Yesh, of existence, to the creations that we do. We human beings build all the time things. We make Yesh mi Yesh. Whether we're building a business, whether it's a technology, whether it's reshaping one thing or another, everything we do is Yesh mi Yesh. It's all within the paradigm of existence. Yesh ma'ayin is an appreciation of existence coming into being from a state that was non-existence, or at least non-existence as we understand existence. And that's what the Hizbanus, the contemplation, has to be about. So when we say Hashem Echad, we're saying Hashem Echad, we're saying that the divine, the creator and the creation is unlike anything that is created from within the creation, which is from one form to another form, Yesh mi Yesh, cause and effect, which are commensurate to one another, and there's also an impact. Every level is impacted by the level that it engages with. Like we discussed, person is involved in teaching something, so their mind is immersed in that and affects them. When it comes to the creation has a very unique way how it works. First of all, there's nothing in common between the creator and the creation. They're infinitely distant. And one is completely bligvul, one is gvul. And secondly, the creator does not have to exert himself, and nothing happens, there's no change. And to understand that, we have the example of oir, light, that the light that comes from something does not affect the source where it's coming from. So the light of the sun, or the light of the nefesh, of the soul, the fact that where that light is shining may not arrive there, either due to, let's say, it's a cloudy day, or it's dark outside, or in the human being is due to an injury or a handicap, the nefesh, the oir, the nefesh is not affected by that. The nefesh remains complete. So this is all coming to explain to us a different type of reality. So when we talk about everything that we interact with, that we are, all the negotiations and all the interactions of existence, obviously, we're not talking about relationship with the God. And therefore, it's all in the materialistic world, or even if it's in the spiritual world, it's all within existence. By appreciating and introducing another type of reality called the divine reality, we're ultimately going to learn that the nefesh habamis can also be infected by that. In a way, you could say there's an expression, ein chavish mater satzmei. The Talmud says a person who is tied up, is in fetters, cannot free themselves. If you're bound up, someone tied you up on ropes or chains, you can't free yourself because you're the one, you're trapped in it. Psychologically, it means that you can't solve a problem from within the system where the problem was created. So if you are part of the problem or you're part of your own subjectivity, you need some outside help. You need someone else to come and throw you a rope, someone else to untie you, or psychologically speaking, someone to give you a fresh perspective that's not your own, so you could have some type of new way of looking at things. So many ways you can say the nefesh habamis, as long as it's exposed to materialistic type of thinking, it's not going to change its personality. But when it's taught that there's another form of reality called a non-existential reality, an ayin, yesh and ayin, that ultimately has an effect on the mind of the nefesh habamis and ultimately on its emotions, as we shall learn as we go further into this discussion. Just wanted to keep it in context here. But meanwhile, we're discussing now what is the reality of creation itself? What is its true dynamics? And the first thing we need to know, this reality of material existence is not a necessity, and it's not something that's absolute. It's not absolute reality. It's a created reality. It's a created reality. And that created reality is called a yesh. And the yesh is, as I said, infinitely distant, nothing in common with the creator, the ayin, and it does not affect. As I discussed yesterday, there's the reality of atzmus is higher than shinui. In the parentheses we learned yesterday, the last thing we learned was that doesn't mean to say that atzmus is not the creator. He's saying that even though the fact of the matter is the oir is true, it doesn't impact atzmus, but the oir is only carrying the power of atzmus to create. That's where the parentheses came to qualify. It's because it's coming from atzmus, and only atzmus can create yesh ma'ayin, to create something that that does not feel it has a source, something to create oir. So there you could say it doesn't have to be created by something that is not atzmus. You could say oir can be created by something. The sun, for example, produces light. The sun is not mitziuse matzmuse, but to create a yesh, it has to come from atzmus mitziuse matzmuse, and yet it travels through the light. Light is the way God does it, and that but being that it's coming from our other, so you have the best of both worlds. It's coming from atzmus, but it's not affecting atzmus. And the best way to understand it is with the example of light. Oir ha-shemesh, or oir ha-levana, or oir ha-nefesh. So bottom line is that what we have here is the process that there's no shinui. That's the parentheses. I'm going to continue learning now after the parentheses on the page 1468, the line that begins, Shum ispilus chas v'shalom, after the parentheses. So the pages can be found, if you want to follow the text, at ayinbeis.com. So he says like this now, Ube'emes, and in truth, Gam b'ha'ora lo yesh shum shini v'ispilus klal me'isabus. So till now, we've been talking about the creator, that atzmus is not affected. And in kol shkem v'kal v'chemer, even the sun, the very sun is not affected because it's cloudy. If the sun is shining, middle of the day, and the sunlight is emerging from the sun, but then for whatever reason, there is an eclipse, or there's a very cloudy day. Does that affect the sun? Does the sun affect it more or less? No. The sun is doing its job. The fact that the recipient can't receive it for whatever side reason, because there's some impediment, doesn't affect. But now he's going further. He says, even the oir, even the light is not affected by whether it's received or not by the recipient. Also, under the reflection, the divine light, there's also no shinui, no change and no impact from creation. Remember, we've been using the verse, I, God, Hashem is Leishan Yisi. And now he's emphasizing Ani Hashem is not necessarily Atzmos. Because Hashem, the Shem Havayu, B'chinas Ha'er V'Agili. You're saying not just Atzmos, Ani Hashem, even Elokus, as it manifests in a name called Havayu, which is already a Er V'Gilui, Mina Etzem, there too is Ani Lo Shanisi. So the Shin, there's no Shin, not only in the Atzmos, that's Mitzusim Atzmusei, Atzmos Mamish, but also the light, as we see. Let's go back to the sun. Not just the sun is not impacted, the sunlight is also not impacted if it's a cloudy day. Same thing with the nefesh. The nefesh has the faculty, let's say, the power to see. The power to see is emanating from the soul. It goes, but let's say for whatever reason, your eyes are closed. Or God forbid, a person's eyes have been somewhat compromised, damaged, an injury. He used the example of a blind person. That doesn't affect not the power of vision and not the light of vision. It only affects the actualization of it. But there's no change. Everything remains intact, both in the etzem and the oir. That's what he's adding also. What he's adding now. So we're talking about Ani Havaya, Havaya Oir and Gili, also Leishanisi. There's no change. And the Rebbe Rashab adds in the parentheses, V'hainu, and this means, Shagam Behei Achrena, because Yud Kei Havaya consists of the whole word of Havaya is Yud Kei Vav Kei. So it's not just the Yud and the Hey and the Vav, but also the last Hey, which refers to B'chinas HaMalchus Leishanisi Cloud. So this is even a bigger Chiddush, that Havaya in its entirety, Leishanisi. So even the part of Havaya that's Malchus, that does associate and will relate to existence, it channels the energy toward existence, also Leishanisi. This is going to be very important as we go further, because once we talk about the divine as it relates to existence, you can say then already there is something commensurate, and seemingly there is some impact. But we'll discuss that soon, and we already discussed it earlier. If you recall, we talked about how Maisa Tachtenim, our actions below, where does it reach? So if you remember, he spoke about it, that it reaches the level of, now I remember, that was the potter's wheel. That was the tikla. It reaches the level of Malchus. We'll soon discuss this more. But he's saying now, even Malchus Leishanisi, even the Hey Achrena. Hey Achrena is referring to the second Hey in Yud Kei Vav Kei. So Yud is Chachmi usually. The Hey of Yud Kei Vav Kei is Bina. The Vav is Zah, the Mides, Chesed through Yesod, and the last Hey is Malchus. So the 10 spheres are structured in 4 categories: Chachma, Bina, Zah, Malchus. It's also like the 4 worlds: Atzilus, Bri, Yitzir, Asiya. But here he's referring to the Hey Achrena. It's Leishanisi Klal. Ki gam ha'ore eine bechinas slapshus v'tfisa ba'nevroim. Because also the reflection, also the light of the divine, even the divine light, not just the divine etzem, the core source, is not tislapshus. It doesn't engage, it doesn't enclose itself, vitfisa, and is not contained or grasped by the nivroim. It remains somewhat removed from it. And the creation process, even from where, is with a leap. It's a quantum leap. There's a certain measure of distance. In a human being, if you want to take a piece of, let's say, clay and want to shape it into a pot, or you take a piece of gold or any other object and you want to shape it into an ornament, you can't do that in a way that's not islapshus. You have to take the object and you have to use your hands or use a machine or whatever it may be to reshape it and fine it and refine it and polish it and so on. You want to throw a stone. You can't just stand in one place and not apply yourself. You have to exert yourself and you throw the stone. So number one is there's an erech between you and the thing that you're doing. And there's also a shinui, because when you exert yourself to throw a stone, somewhat, it's not necessarily exhausts you, but to say that you're completely not affected, of course you are. And if it's a heavy stone and it's and you're throwing it distant, you're not going to be able to throw another stone that quickly. You need to rest. Just to use examples. In other words, every pu'ula, anything we manufacture, anything we create in the world of yesh miyesh, number one, requires applying yourself, something commensurate between you and the thing you're producing, between producer and the product, teacher and student, seichel and midas, as we've learned, and it affects in some way. Here he's saying, not only is the etzem, the creator, not distant, infinitely distant, and not affected, but also the oir that he uses is also remains removed to some extent. We'll learn more about this as we go. Of course, this is all part of the izbananus of when we say Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Hashem Elokeinu, that even Elokeinu is also Hashem. Even Elokeinu as the divine manifests in Elokeinu, in Mamala Kalamin, like in this case, Malchus, and it also remains Hashem and above it all. But we're going to learn much more about this as we go. Because not just the core source, but also the reflection of the core source is also in a state of Ein Sof, no end, and Bli Gvul, and infinite. Like he said before in the bottom of the previous page, he said that if the Nivraim were commensurate to the Boida, the creation was commensurate to the creator, the product was commensurate to the producer, then it would have to have Bli Gvul in it, because the producer is Bli Gvul. So he's saying the same thing with Oir. Oir is Ein Sof, is Ein Sof and Bli Gvul, and therefore EF Shashiyim is Nivraim Bali Gvul. So it can't naturally, it's not a natural cause and effect that you just allow the light to manifest and suddenly it becomes Gvul. It won't. It needs a quantum leap. It needs a paradigm shift. We'll learn it soon later. It's the Tzimtzum that helps achieve that. But bottom line, there's a leap between creator, not only creator, but the creative energy of the light, a leap between that and the creation. But the fact is that we know God created the world in a way of islapshus. He said, Yehi Oir, Yehi Rakia. He didn't just do it in an aloof way, completely removed. There is a form of koyach hapel benifel. We know that just like the human invests, Hashem invested divine energy within the nifel. So he says, but it's that would actually manifest within creation is a reflection of a reflection. So he's adding now another level. So you have the etzem that's on a different level altogether. You have the oir is also removed. Then there's a reflection of the reflection that does ultimately enter into existence like a koyach hapel benifel, but it's not the oir itself, it's a reflection of the oir. So we have now another third level. The gam bezeh ain't shina mitzad the etzem ki mitzad ha'yislapshus. And even in this case, and I'll explain this now in a moment. Let me just finish reading the line. Even the ha'ara of the ha'ara, there's no shina mitzad the etzem. It's only mitzad the islapshus. It's only mitzad the islapshus. 1 second. Let me just, I want to show this. So let me explain what that means. Okay. The truth is he's going to explain it in the next pages, but just to make it a little easier to relate to, let me just explain. I'm going to give a few examples. Since we're using sunlight as an example, I'm going to use example sunlight. I'll use an example from the Nefesh, and then I'll use a third example as well, just to make this point very, very clear. And this is very fundamental. I alluded to it yesterday, but when the Kabbalists talk about whether oir has any particles or is it completely seamless, their disagreement on this matter, well, it's not really disagreement. The different opinions on this matter is all about how integrated and how connected is the divine to existence. Because on one hand, if you want to keep the divine very pure, so you want to make the light and the divine energy as seamless as possible. If you want the divine energy to be more integrated and more relate to us, then you want the divine energy to have particles in it. So this is a long discussion about Eris and Kalim, but I want to talk about it in more like almost in scientific terms. So there's no question that the sun is not impacted by the light that shines on Earth. So in other words, if it's a cloudy day, the sun does not get weaker from it. The sun doesn't get stronger if it's a clear day. That's clear. The sunlight as well, as he said, also is not affected. Yet, you could find an example where there will be an effect. What about the sunlight as it becomes absorbed? You see, for example, a person can get a suntan. We know the sun gives off infrared, ultraviolet, X-rays, even all kinds of things that do affect the person. So you could argue that that level of light, as it's affecting us, is also affected in turn. The truth is, it's probably not affected. But you could also say, once the light is being absorbed, and we see this, not that you could cut the light off from its source, but you could manipulate that light. And we do it all the time. There are many ways that science today manipulates sunlight into using it to achieve different objectives. So he's saying, even if that's the case, that the light is somewhat being affected, but that's not the very core light that's coming from the sun. That's already the light as it's somewhat mislabish and manifest within the person, within existence. To use the example of, let's go back to the example of a seeing person and a blind person. So yes, the nefesh, it remains intact, whether the eye is intact, the eye is healthy or not healthy. For example, a person who doesn't have 20/20 vision does not mean that the core vision of the etzem hariyah, koyach hariyah, and his nefesh is compromised. It means with age, or just the chemical makeup, or the way this person is the way he's wired, his eyes got weaker, so cannot access the full 20/20 vision of the power of vision. But it doesn't affect the power of vision. It doesn't affect the optic nerve as well, meaning the energy that flows from the power of vision into the eye. But you could say that it will have some impact on a lower level, but that impact it will have will be only on the level that manifests within. That's what he's saying at the end here. The shin is mitzad the etzem, it's only mitzad the islapshus. I think the best example would be a teacher and a student. So when a teacher is taking an idea and he's taking his brilliant mind and now channeling the idea toward a student. So obviously, the teacher doesn't change in any way due to the fact that he's teaching the student. Meaning he doesn't get less brilliant. Just because he's teaching you Aleph, Beis, Gimel, does not mean that he's forgotten everything he knows. He's just not revealing it all. So as he's communicating with the student, he's only communicating the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, of what's going on in his mind. Now, not only is his mind remain intact, also the oir. The oir of the teacher is also not affected. Just because the student is a beginner or doesn't fully understand, it doesn't mean that the teacher in any way is compromised by that. But then there is a level where the teacher engages with the student to the point that the student starts asking questions. And the teacher has to apply himself. And the teacher could also have to dig deeper to explain it better. Or the teacher could even get frustrated. So you see that there is some impact that it can have even on the oir of the teacher, but it's only on the lowest level, and it's not due to the etzem, it's due to the islapshus. Because if the teacher really cares about the student, he's going to care and apply himself. Like sometimes a teacher will put himself in the shoes of his students to try to understand it from their perspective. Because from his perspective, it's very clear, the idea. But the student is asking a question, and the teacher sees something is something. So what does the teacher do? The teacher will go and be mislabish himself, and let's see how the student is looking at it. That still does not change the teacher's etzem and oir. But mitzad islapshus, you could say there's a shinui now because the teacher has applied himself. I'm just giving some examples. So the same thing with creation. Atzmus is for sure not affected. Even the oir of atzmus, oir ein sof, is also not. But then there's a level of oir, ha'ara of ha'ara, a reflection that will relate to existence, and there can be an effect. So when they say, for example, the Maimer Yehi Oir or Yehi Rakia, there that's already being shaped and tailored. The energy is being tailored toward the Rakia, toward Oir, toward vegetation, toward creation. So there you can say the Oir Be'etzem still remains unaffected. But as long as it's impacting, there is some effect. So, for example, from the Pardasi is the example, if you take colorless liquid and put it into tinted tubes, right? Into tinted glass. So colorless liquid, water, it's colorless. You put it into a blue tube, it's going to look blue. In a red tube, it's going to look red. The truth is, the water is not changed at all. But to the eye, it looks different colors. What happens if you put in a tint into the water itself? Not that the tinted glass. You actually put coloring inside the water, so the water itself is going to turn blue. It'll turn red. But the water itself, be'etzem, is still colorless. It's just you've added something, and the water, since it's coming into that place where it could be colored, it's assuming the color, at least for that time. So you could see here that something could be etzem, be unchanged, but then when it manifests in a certain way, it will be impacted by the color that you're applying there. I'm just giving examples of how you could see here that, and you want to really have all the levels. The divine that's completely remains intact and completely pure elikus. You have Oyer Eliki that also remains intact, but it's Oyer at least. And then you have a Oyer that does Ha'ara of Ha'ara that does interact and is going to be impacted. Now, we learned some of this earlier on page 1429, and he's going to come back to it a little later when he spoke about where Ma'aseh Tachtenim, when we do mitzvahs, when we do actions below, does it impact Hashem? So we learned it doesn't impact the higher levels. It impacts Malchus, and once the door between Malchus and Zog is opened, it inevitably also opens up new channels from above, even though it doesn't impact it. I don't know if you remember discussing this, but this was discussed on page 1428 and on. And we're going to get back to it a little later when we talk about it more. But bottom line is, the key thing is to remember that we want to have a pure experience of the divine that's unaffected by us, while also having the divine as it's integrated within us. So it's like when you do a mitzvah, yes, on one hand, the mitzvah does impact heaven. We say gives reich nechayach. God has pleasure from our mitzvahs. But then there's a level where it doesn't have a direct impact, and yet Hashem still wants it. And both are necessary because one gives us more of an experience of the divine on the terms of the divine, and one is an experience of the divine on our terms. And they're both relevant. In other words, you want to have a connection on both levels. You want to have God that relates to us, but you also want a connection with God that's beyond us. And that's ultimately part of this whole discussion of Achdus and Yichud Ilah and Yichud Tata. So that's what we just finished learning here, the end of this paragraph on page 1468. I'll stop if anybody wants to ask any questions. It's a pretty fundamental and pretty heavy piece as well, so may take a little time to fully digest.
Yes, two things. One is that this relate. So we're basically having a relationship with the etzem. This is the deepest level where we're not affecting it. So, but he's still, that etzem is affecting us. We just don't affect it. It's a one-way relationship, so to speak, with that deepest level.
I wouldn't call it one way. We don't want it to be affected because, like I said yesterday, you want experience of Lo Shanisi, and it should be intact. If God was affected by us, then you don't have God in his purest form. So you want to have both. Yes, so I wouldn't call it one way. I would say, yes, there's no question God creates us. That's for sure. The question, when you say effect, remember, effect doesn't always mean a mila. You know, God can still love you and be connected and want to be with you, even though he's not affected by you. On his terms. That's why I discussed yesterday, do we have a relationship with the God that's beyond us?
Right.
And Chassidus says yes. So it's not, it shouldn't disturb us that God remains God, even while he wants to connect with us. So it's like a level that is not affected because he's beyond being affected by things.
But if he wants to have a connection with us, and say a person does try to establish a connection with him, so in a sense, that ratzon of Hashem at the deepest level is being.
Says no. The answer is no. That's not nitfus. He is able to want something and not necessarily be defined by it,
or affected by it, not defined by it, but
defined and affected. Yes, that's a big part of it. Or else you'd have to then say that we don't have a relationship with that part of God. That's the irony here. Because if you want God on God's terms, that's the only way you can have it. If you want God on our terms, then he will be affected, but it won't be that.
It might be like seeing a picture of a person that never saw his father, sees a picture of his father. He's having a relationship with that picture, but has no effect on the father in reality.
Okay, that's a technical example. But you have to keep in mind, when we're talking about Atzmus, you talk about, it's not anything that has anything in common with us. So either you have no relationship with it at all, or you have a relationship with it by understanding that it's never going to have anything in common with you, though Nesava, God desires to want to have a dir b'tachteinim. And that's all that needs to be known, that he wants it, and that's it. Even wanting is not the right word, but that is considered to be actually the highest form of elevation, because there's nothing in it for us, in a sense. It's not like, oh, now that I'm close to you, you're infected and I'm affected, and let's both interact with each other. There are levels of that in our relationship with God, but not when you're talking about Atzmus. You're talking about, you've now come to a point, and we've talked about it many, many times, and you brought this up many times. Right. You cannot think in terms of what's in it for me. As soon as you think that, you're not going to connect with Atzmus. So on lower levels, yes, we begin on those levels, but at some point you come mature to the point where you're ready to suspend everything about yourself and just allow Atzmus to be there and emerge. And it doesn't have to affect them or not affect them. That should not be your concern. Like most of us in a relationship, we'd say, hey, I'm affected by you, and I want to know that you're affected by me. Imagine having a spouse that's only, as you said, one way. I'm affected by you're affected by your spouse, but she's not affected by you. That would not be considered a healthy relationship. You want that engagement. Ani l'daidi v'daidi li. But with Atzmus, because Atzmus is Atzmus, there remains, he's not your wife and he's not your spouse. There's a level where Hashem marries and Yom Chasanos is and that we're connected like husband and wife. But then there's a level of Atzmus that's beyond it all.
Right, the ultimate Helamatzmi, in a sense.
Even beyond that, even higher than that as well, yeah.
And the second question I have is when, if a teacher is preparing a class or a lesson, and he starts speaking in his office, and he just starts speaking it. Nobody's there. There's no student. There's no hislapshus. But the mere fact of speaking the lesson does affect his understanding, and maybe comes up with new ideas in his thought process that he wouldn't have had if he hadn't gone through that process of manifestation, of revelation, even though there's no hislapshus in it because there's nobody listening to him. But he himself has changed by it.
Okay, I mean, you say, what do you mean by change? Because he grows in his understanding of the idea through his applying himself that way. Right. Is that what you mean?
Right. The mere verbalization of it could change.
Well, that's really why a teacher and student is more of an example, yesh mi-yesh, like he gave in the previous page. It's really not a good example for what we're learning here. I only gave it as an example to bring out that there is a level where his mind doesn't change because he's teaching, and then there's a level where he does engage more. But in truth, if you go back to the previous page, teacher-student was an example for ilah v'ol, where the teacher does get a change, that a teacher is changed. So it's not, I would be careful, I would not go there all the way, because it's not really an example for what we're learning.
But even the one that's the blind.
It's not really, it's not pure, it's not pure, it's like more shefa. I'm sorry?
even the example of a blind parent who's blind from birth gives birth to a seeing person. The ability to see, if they do see, how do we know it does not affect the kochos of Ria, rather than the Giloi, Rak the Giloi? He sees, but it might actually have some type of feedback process that it would affect the actual kochos themselves.
Even if, yes, I would say is the ha'ara of the koyach, not the koyach itself. Because today, for example, I think even science will tell you the optic nerves, and even if the optic nerve is damaged, God forbid, but the nerve the part in the brain that the optic nerve arouses is not affected unless there's damage there too. We're not talking about that. And therefore, that's why they can create technologies that if you can link directly to that part of the brain that gets stimulated through vision, you can bypass all any of the impact. So there may be impact on some level, but nefesh for sure not. But I would say even the oir of the nefesh also not. How do we know? First of all, it's logical. It makes sense. Because why would it affect the oir of the nefesh more than talking about the oir, not the keli, and not the channel between the oir and the keli. Keep that in mind. Is there such a thing as a person whose brain just simply doesn't see, doesn't have the power to see, even in the very brain itself? I don't know if there's such a thing. I don't know if that exists. In other words, all handicaps that we talk about are either in the mamish de keli, like a damaged eye, or a damaged nerve, or a damaged connection between the nerve and the brain, or something like that. So I don't know. I didn't study it completely, but generally speaking, blindness is not associated with the source. It's associated with either the channel from the source to the eye, or to the eye, or some part of the eye. That's, I think, a pretty basic understanding of it. So is there look, I'm sure the fact that a person, let's say, God forbid, can't see, I'm sure what it does is to the neurons, it may rewire things and have some effect on the neurology, on the very neurotransmitters.
Right.
But I wouldn't know. I wouldn't call that the nefesh or even the eira nefesh. That's to one of the mechanical parts, and it does go back. I understand that. I didn't. We're not talking about completely. That's why maybe what he's saying now, the ha'ara of the ha'ara. Right. I would call that the ha'ara of the ha'ara, not necessarily the oir, or definitely not the etzem.
Got you. Okay. Ha'ara should the or. Maybe that's okay. Maybe.
It makes total sense because my reading, and I remember not just with vision, with hearing, other faculties, that there's no question that science is working, that if you can create the right type of, what do they want to call it? The right type of chips that can be put into the brain, they could have people seeing that were blind, born blind even. They just haven't figured out all the different methods of doing so. But I'm almost sure I've read that the future, that's what the future holds.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so now I was going to continue and explain this. As I said, this is all based on the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, and I could even refer to you. Basically, this is page 375 and 376 on the Maimer Maimori Admur Amtsoi that was posted on the group. Maimori Admur Amtsoi on the Maimer Mi Kashem Elokeinu. Okay, so let's continue reading. Va'inyan hu. This is further explaining the non-impact of the production on the producer, so to speak, the product on the producer. And I'm going to give another example, if I may be helpful. You want to have a relationship with the Rebbe, let's say. Okay. So if anyone that knew the Rebbe was a person of a different level completely. He's not a guy that the Rebbe was not one of these guys that you would have met and said, okay, let's have coffee together, become friends. Different level. A king in his palace, a man of God, like Moshe Rabbeinu. So you could say to yourself, okay, my only relationship with him is I'll learn his teachings, I'll follow his directives, and through that I have a relationship. I'm like a soldier in his army, a shliach of the Mishalech. And as such, there's a relationship. Shluch Shaladim Kamoisai, and the Mishalech is engaged and it wants me to do this. I'm not just doing on my own. It's actually part of how I build a relationship. But you'll ask yourself a question: can I ever have a relationship with the etzem of the Rebbe? How he is on his own, not how he is when he's teaching, or when he's giving directives, or when he's leading and guiding us. How he is on his own. Moshe Rabbeinu on Mount Sinai, when he's talking to God. Can we connect with him on that place? So you could argue both ways. You could say, no, that's off limits. Your connection is in the area where he relates to you. And when you connect there, you're ultimately also connecting to the way he is. Be'etzem. You just can't directly connect there because it's a different dimension. But remember, what he's teaching you and what he's directing you is also he received from Hashem. It's not his own ideas. So essentially, it's like a Torah. Anon nafshi k'savis yahavis. You may not get the etzem on its own, but you're getting the etzem as it manifests through Torah, through these guidelines. So when you do a mitzvah or you do a mitzvah, you're following a guideline the Rebbe said, learn Rambam. You're not just connecting to the Rebbe as he's teaching, telling us about Rambam. You're also connecting to who he is but you're not directly getting to know him on that level. You're not his chaver. You're not his friend. You're not his colleague and equal, but you're connecting that way. That's one way to understand it. Or another way is you want to connect with him on that level. You have to give up all your own identity. But if you want to stay intact as who you are, while also connecting to that level, it doesn't work together. What Chassidus really comes to teach is you could have both. But the mere fact that you realize that the etzem of the Rebbe is not commensurate to you should not be seen as distance. It should be seen as appreciating the emes of it. If you want the Rebbe as he is on his terms, you need to accept it. You don't want him to compromise. You don't want him to dilute himself and limit himself to fit into your place. But to do that, you have to go through many levels. You have to first climb the ladder and appreciate the Rebbe on your terms. You learn his Torah, you follow his guidelines. And as you grow in that, you can begin to absorb and appreciate even the things that are beyond you without becoming annihilated in the process. And actually understand that the mere fact that I've talked many times, that the mere fact there's a mystique shouldn't throw us. Mystique actually tells us that you're actually getting closer to the emes. Because if you understood it too well, it was too much on your terms, you know it's not the real thing, it's not the etzem. So the mystique is something to embrace. And embracing the mystique of the etzem, it itself creates a relationship. So I just wanted to add a little more in understanding this whole concept. The thing is, we are such control freaks, and we so much want things on our terms. We are consumers, and a consumer you want, and we're acquisition experts, right? We're acquirers. We like to acquire things, but there's some things you can't own. You can't own truth. You can't own atzmus. You can't own the etzem, and you don't want to own it. You want it to remain pure. But at the same time, you want to be able to benefit from it, if you wish, or appreciate it and connect with it. And that's part of understanding these higher levels that are not affected by us. And again, the not affecting should not be seen as being aloof and distant. As it's actually understanding on the contrary, understanding the true nature of it is such that you want to say, I want to connect to something that is not affected by me. That means I'm connecting to something real that's real and not compromised in any way. Just adding a little few more words, also for my own understanding of it. Okay. Va'inyan hu. And the inyan in this, and this is actually quoting from the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, Dihine benefesh ha'adam, he's going back to nefesh ha'adam. Nefesh ha'adam, we're talking about the soul. It means that the biological, the soul, the nefesh, the spirit that gives a human being life. Harihu mispa'eles b'mikri haguf. Harihi mispa'eles b'mikri haguf. So now he's coming and saying something new. We know, even though before he said that it's not affected by the events of the body. When something happens to the body, the soul is not affected. But in some places it says that the nefesh ha'adam is mispa'eles. Mimikri aguf. Kamoi. Bekilkul be'eze ever. If there's an injury to any limb, hirgish targish hanefesh asai ka'ev. The nefesh will feel pain. It's not just the body feels pain, the nefesh feels pain as well. Where do we know this from? First of all, it says it in Chassidus, that nefesh mispeles mimikri aguf. Also, pain, a dead person doesn't feel pain. So you can't say it's just the nerves and reflexes. You have to say in some way it's affecting the nefesh. V'yitzar lenefesh. And this will be painful to the nefesh if there's an injury to any aver. I know you'll say, doesn't that contradict what he said on the top of the page, that a blind person can give birth to a healthy child, to a seeing child? We'll get there. So just be patient. He's coming to explain these two levels of relationship here. Hagam shemushlelsi mechol toyer hageshem, even though the soul and the spirit is completely negates and defies any toyer hageshem, any physical structure, any physical definition. Because the soul does not change from the way it was before it entered the body. So how do you reconcile this? On one hand, you say the soul is not a body. The soul is a separate entity. The soul remains intact. It goes into the body. Nothing changes. The same soul. And yet you're saying that the pain of the body or the injury to a limb in some way affects and causes pain to the soul. Umakol mokim, and nevertheless, though the soul remains intact, mispa'elasi mimikri aguf. It nevertheless is impacted mimikri aguf. Mikri aguf, by the way, mikra here means like occurrences, from the word things that happen to the body, basically bodily experiences. Umuchrach lemer, and we must say the shneim emes, that both these things are true. On one hand, the soul remains beyond the body, and at the same time, it's affected. Both are true. Because when the soul descended from its natural spiritual place and was manifest enclosed within the blood and flesh, dam and bus, essentially flesh and blood in the opposite order, blood and flesh of the human body, had a bedam atzmei hu islapshas hanefesh haruchni. It didn't just come in like a bystander. It actually manifests within the dam. The nefesh ruchni, the spiritual nefesh, now is in the blood. Ukmoishe kosav, which is why he says in Pasha Re'eh, v'lo seichel hanefesh ima bosar. You should not eat the nefesh, the energy, the soul with the body. What does that mean? So the pasuk says, "Ki adam hu nefesh." Hari nikra adam nefesh. Ki adam hu nefesh, because the blood is called nefesh. But you'll say blood is a physical thing. It's not so pashut. In Yiddishkeit, in Torah it says clearly the dam is the nefesh has become blood. Blood is not just a liquid that is carrying the nefesh. It's called Adam Hu Nefesh. That's the language in the pasuk. That's why you're not allowed to eat blood. That's why it says, don't eat the nefesh with the basar. So what do you see from this? That the soul on its own is beyond blood. The soul, before it came into a human body, you wouldn't say it had nothing to do with blood. And yet when it comes, it becomes completely internalized, completely integrated with the blood. That the blood itself is called the nefesh. To that extent. So you see here somewhat of a paradox, back and forth. He's going to explain it, but that's what he's saying right now. The nikra zeh, and this is called Ruchnius She'B'Gashmius. The dam is called Ruchnius She'B'Gashmius. It's Gashmius because the blood is a physical entity. We know that. Blood is physical. But it's the Ruchnius in Gashmius. Hainu Ruchnius HaNefesh She'B'Dam. Meaning the spirit, the ethereal of the you can call it the spirit of the nefesh that is within the blood. So there's the physical blood is the gashmis, and there's the ruchnius shebegashmis, that's the nefesh shebedam. She'ein lezeh erech afil lahagashmis sheberuchni. Okay, one second. Let's take this. Let's pause a moment. Okay, so that's that. But before I continue, any questions on this? So what he's introduced now is another dimension of understanding that even though the nefesh itself is removed, but there's a part that does manifest into body and is affected by the body. We'll soon learn how to reconcile it with everything we've been learning till now. But clearly, he's going to the ha'ara of the ha'ara that is affected, even though the etzem hanefesh and the eira nefesh is not. But we haven't gone there yet. So this is somewhat of an elaborate discussion on the dimension of the nefesh that is Ruchnius She'B'Gashmius. He's now going to continue and explain that Ruchnius She'B'Gashmius is distant even from Gashmius She'B'Ruchnius, which means how the nefesh is becoming the geshem within the nefesh. We'll talk about that shortly. But I want to stop if anybody wants to ask anything before I continue. Okay. Okay, before I continue, let me just give a little introduction here. I think it's important. Chassidus talks very much about the fact that that even though everything, God has the power to do anything, but God has made the world in a way, as much as we can understand with seichel, he tried to manifest things in ways that make sense. So of course, God could have created a body in this world and not even have a soul, and just make the body come alive. But we would not have with the seichel we have today, it wouldn't make sense. We wouldn't understand how it's working. It would like be like a miracle. So one of the ways that Hashem uses to create things is everything has interfaces. That when two things come together that seemingly are opposites, there's always an interface that connects the two. So let's take, for example, we talk about shemen and psila, a wick that creates a candle. So we learned in volume 1 that you need to have the proper wick and the proper type of oil. If the wick, for example, is made out of metal, it's not going to ignite. If it's made out of a very thin piece of thread, it's going to burn out so quickly. So a wick has to have a certain amount of thickness, but not too thick and not too thin. That's why there's a whole parak in Masechta Shabbos, but memadlikin. What can you use as a wick? And some things are very, we call it, what do you call it? Combustible. What do you say? Certain things are flammable, and some things are not flammable. And there's halachas about this. So the Ayin Beis explained that the wick has two parts to it. One part is the gashmi of the wick, and then there's the wick that's conducive to absorb Excuse me. So there's the wick, the physical part of the wick, and then there's the part of the wick that is conducive to absorb the oil and also to contain to hold, to allow a flame to emerge. She explains there that both the flame and the wick have Gashmi She'B'Ruchni, is the fire too. If you just take a very large torch, it won't burn properly in a candle. So the fire has to have something that makes the fire, the Ruchni of the fire has to have a Gashmi She'B'Ruchni to connect with the Ruchni She'B'Gashmi of the wick. So you really have four levels here. You have the Geshem, you have the Ruach, you have the Ruach She'B'Geshem, the Ruach She'B'Geshem that meets the Geshem She'B'Ruach. So think of a translator between English and Hebrew. So someone speaks Hebrew, someone speaks English. The translator has to have both. He has to be able to speak Hebrew and has to be able to speak English. And then he connects the two. So when you really come down to it, it's four levels. There's the two languages, and then there's the translator who knows how to take from the Hebrew to English and from the English to Hebrew. So the same thing he says here, when the nefesh connects with the body, it's not just a physical and spiritual entities coming together. There's something in the body that has something that's Ruchni She'B'Gashmi. That's the blood. That's why you see blood is more refined. You don't say basar hu nefesh. You don't say raglayim hu nefesh, because there are parts of the body that are primarily are the physical part. The blood within the body, God made it. What? Are you talking to me? The blood within the body is a far more refined and almost an ethereal entity. It's almost like a little mysterious entity that is like the Ruchni She'B'Geshem. But the same thing's on the level of the nefesh. For a nefesh to come into a body, it also can't just be pure spiritual like a torch. It has to also have a Geshem She'B'Ruach that allows the soul to slowly manifest itself to be able to fit into the body. And that's what he's now going to explain, how this Gashem She'B'Ruach and the Ruach She'B'Geshem are apart from each other, even though they will meet. That's the next section that he's addressing. Let me read a few lines and then we'll stop here. She says like this. So this Ruchni She'B'Gashmi called Dam, she'ein lo ze erech afil la'Gashmi She'B'Ruchni. It does not have an erech, the blood, which is like the ruach, the spirit within the matter of the body, is not commensurate, not only with the spirit, but even with the Gashmi She'B'Ruchni, shu etzem haruchni she'b'nefesh k'mo shehi torem boy leguf. So the etzem ruchni of the nefesh, before it came to the body, was a purely spiritual entity. The af mashiyesh bo koyach ha'izgalus ve'ispashtus, even though that soul has to have a power of revelation and expression or extension. Lahachis kol geshem, to be able to give life to the physical body. Shenikra gashmi she'b'ruchnius. So in other words, the soul, even before it came to the body, has to have some type of expression for be able to fit into a body. Just as the body needs to have dam to receive the soul needs to also have something that, in a sense, you can say like a platform or an interface that allows the soul to enter into the body. Nevertheless, l'maylo hu gavoya harba. The word gavoya is in Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. It's much higher mebchinas haruchnius she'b'gashmius. The Geshem She'B'Ruach, the Gashmi She'B'Ruchni, is much higher than the Ruchni She'B'Gashmi, the blood. The Hainu HaNefesh HaMislabeshes Murkeves B'Dam, the nefesh that encloses and manifests itself and gets intertwined and together with the blood. The Imayes, the Shneim Himrak HaOris HaNefesh, even though both these levels, the Ruach She'B'Geshem, the blood, and the Geshem She'B'Ruach, which is the soul's manifesting itself in an expression that it can enter into a body, even though they're both a reflection of the nefesh, and the general point of this reflection is to give life, is to energize, which means the power to reveal, which is what makes it the Geshem Sheberuach. Nevertheless, what comes in a very revealed way when the soul enters the body in the blood, that's a lower level in the ha'ara. That's the ha'ara of the ha'ara haba mitchinas nivdol me'etzem haruchnius she'b'nefesh. Nevertheless, that becomes a level that's separate from the etzem, from the core spirituality of the nefesh. So I'm going to stop here because time reasons. But the point that he's making here is he's explaining the idea of the ha'ara, that even though the nefesh itself is spiritual and therefore not touched by the body, but there's a part that does manifest and becomes somewhat separate from that spirit. That's how the nefesh becomes part of the blood. And that's where there's going to be the impact of the pain of the body, the mikri haguf, the events that take place in the body, the experiences of the body will affect the nefesh. So he's adding another dimension. There's the etzem nefesh, there's the ur nefesh, that's still ruchni, and even the gashmi sheberuchni, it's revealing itself. And then there's the Ruchnius She'B'Gashmius, which is how the nefesh becomes dam. The nefesh becomes part of the body, manifesting it in the blood. That's what he's explaining now. It's pretty heavy stuff, but we'll discuss it more in the next class. I'll stop for questions before we conclude, because he has more to say on this topic, I see. But this is all from the Mittler Rebbe, and if you're familiar with Mittler Rebbe's language, you can see it's Mittler Rebbe's style. But the Rebbe Rashab is explaining some of the things here. Okay. Any questions?
I just have to say it's wonderful. For years I've been wondering about what was blood, the life, hula, and now it's unbelievable. I can't even. I'm ecstatic about it.
Good. That's good. Yeah.
What are you ecstatic about?
It gives a whole other take on what blood is.
See, what would you
Why
ecstatic
we can't eat the blood? Because it's the life. It says that, and I never knew any idea what that meant. And now, boy, what a difference.
Yeah.
I have trouble understanding Gashmius but Ruchnius. Ruchnius but Gashmius, the nefesh in the blood, I can sort of think about. But Gashmius,
Yeah, because you can point to it. You can't point to the Gashmius She'B'Gashmius.
That's what I'm saying. How? Because I always thought that this is like the secret of Yesh Ma'ayin, that from Ruchnius comes Gashmius. And here the Rebbe is saying there is a level of Gashmius and Ruchnius that it acts as the interface.
So if you look, you see he keeps saying Gashmius She'B'Ruchnius doesn't mean there's something physical in the soul. It means there's the soul has the ability to reveal and express itself in a body. And that has to proceed before it actually enters the body. It's almost like the teacher has to be ready to speak to a student. So he has within him, so-called the student within him is not an actual student, but it's him so-called priming himself to be able to communicate to the student. So that's the same idea. It's like dibur sheba machshava. Think of it like that. It's not actual speech, but in machshava, you're already like in the thought, you're speaking to yourself how you're going to speak to another. So the soul, he's calling the koyach is galus v'ispashtus. Because if a soul, for example, was just a etzem ruchni, it could be such that will never express and will never enter a body. So Hashem made the soul in a way that it also has a way to impart its energy in the body. Look, there are many spiritual energies that will never enter into bodies. They remain spiritual energy removed from any body. Like, for example, Chachma Vatzilus. Chachma Vatzilus does not enter into a body. We have the faculty of Chachma that evolves from there, but it's essentially a spiritual entity, and that's that. But here he's saying that the nefesh itself was so-called created in a way that has elements in it that are going to allow it to enter into the body and not blow the circuits of the body, but work with the body. That's why the soul and the body grow together during pregnancy. So Gashmi She'B'Ruchni, just think in terms, he says clearly, Gashmi She'B'Ruchni means koyeches galus ve'ispashtus. That's what it means. That there's the nefesh beyond being expressed and revealed, and then there's a nefesh that has the power to reveal and express. It's like the flame that's getting ready to be able to be held and contained by a wick. As I said, a major torch power force is not ready to be contained by a wick. It would burn everything up. So, in other words, it has to be primed and primed and shaped to be able to enter into a body. That's what he's saying, basically.
But isn't the koach of Leda, is a big difference than the sperm and the egg, right? You need that special sauce where, spiritual meets the matter, where that actual magic happens, so to speak, where it's finally transformed in that hey achrona of Yudke Vavke. Ruchnius becomes Gashmius, or gives birth to Gashmius. That last step this precedes that, right? The Gashmius and Ruchnius is preceding. It's not the actual final moment where conception occurs between spirituality and physicality in Malchus Ba'asiyah. No,
well, 1 second. A seed fertilizing an egg still does not guarantee a soul entering. God still has to choose that the soul should go there. You can have a seed fertilizing an egg and no child will be conceived.
I'm talking about
not
the
automatic.
Right. I'm not talking about the birth, but the seed itself, the existence of the seed and the existence of this, the physical existence of it.
But how's that related? Here we're talking about how do you get a soul that's completely spiritual and a body? How do you get them together in a way that makes some sense? Obviously, this koyach is this God ultimately that brings them together. But as I said, as much as we can logically understand, how does a seed, for example, turn into a tree? So the seed deteriorates and rots until it becomes part of the ground, and then that power of growth starts developing into something. So here too, you want to know, how does a soul go into a body? So the body has blood that will be a perfect keli, the Ruchnius She'B'Gashmius, to the nefesh. The nefesh has the power of revelation and expression that will be able to manifest inside of a body. That's what he calls Gashmius She'B'Ruchni. I think you're either overthinking or bringing other stuff into this. Why don't you just read this as if you never read anything else? Just read this on its own. I think you're trying to connect it with other things that you've learned.
Mm-hmm. Right. Could be very much true. I've always wondered what actually that final step when Ruchnius turns into Gashmius. Is that
I understand, but that's your thoughts right now. That's not necessarily what he's coming to explain here.
Okay. But my question has always been, is that Yesh Ayin Beis, or is it Yesh
But
Ayin?
you know what? But I'm trying to understand the Rebbe Rashab here. You're talking about a subject which deserves its own conversation, but it'll just confuse matters right now.
Okay.
He's not discussing here how Gashmi comes from Ruchni. That's not what he's asking here. It's not what he's discussing
here. Okay.
He's not explaining Yesh Ma'ayin. He's explaining the idea that the body affects the soul or does not affect the soul. Anyway, let's stop here. I'll go over this again and again as many times as necessary. It is pretty mind-blowing stuff. And I concur with Tzvi. Good stuff here. Okay. So this is rich. Okay, so we'll stop here around 2/3 down the page, 1468.